In the early 2000s, a silent shadow moved through the corridors of hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. His name was Charles Cullen. Dressed in his white uniform, he seemed like another dedicated healthcare professional. But behind the disguise of a caregiver hid one of the deadliest serial killers in American history. Over nearly 2 decades, Cullen worked at least 9 different hospitals. In each of them, he left a mysterious trail of sudden deaths and inexplicable medical conditions. Seriously ill patients died sooner than expected. Others, on the road to recovery, suffered unexpected cardiac arrests. Yet no one suspected him. He was discreet, calm, and even kind. No clear signs of violence or negligence appeared in his records. Then, in 2003, a pair of detectives began a quiet investigation that would change everything. The case started thanks to a nursing team at St. Luke's Hospital in Allentown, Pennsylvania. A nurse named Amy Luffren noticed something strange in the medical records of some patients who had died after receiving medications administered by Cullen. Amy didn't know it yet, but her suspicions would trigger one of the most complex and impactful investigations in recent American police history. She decided to share her doubts with the local police department without realizing what lay ahead. The first clues came from medical data and internal records. Mortality rates spiked dramatically whenever Cullen was on duty. This coincidence did not go unnoticed for long. Detectives Tim Braun and Stephen Carbo were assigned to the case. With experience in hospital-related crimes, they began discreetly gathering evidence, monitoring movements and conversations within the medical environment, where any mistake could compromise the investigation. They discovered that Cullen had previously been fired from other hospitals under vague accusations of misconduct. But there had never been a formal investigation. This indicated a frightening pattern. Technology also played a crucial role in this process. Digital medication records, security cameras, and medicine cabinet access logs began revealing unsettling clues about Cullen's behavior. He had access to powerful medications such as insulin, digoxin, and other drugs capable of causing organ failure in minutes. And the records showed he frequently withdrew unusual quantities of these products. Investigations revealed that Cullen intentionally used these substances to kill patients. Some were already seriously ill, others were recovering. He chose his victims without a clear pattern, only when he could act without drawing attention. Meanwhile, Amy Luffren, the nurse who initially raised the suspicions, became a key figure in collecting information. Without telling anyone, she helped the detectives build a detailed profile of Cullen's behavior inside the hospital. Cullen seemed to have a disturbing ability to fit into any environment. He never drew attention, maintained friendly relations with colleagues, and was even praised for his efficiency. A wolf disguised as a nurse. But truth has its own way of coming to light, and the mistakes Cullen made, however small, began accumulating evidence against him. The detectives realized they were dealing with something bigger than they had imagined. Charles Cullen was born in 1960 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States. At first glance, he seemed like just another child growing up in a typical middle-class American neighborhood. But behind the walls of his home, the reality was very different. From an early age, he faced serious family traumas. His father died when Cullen was still a teenager, leaving an emotional void that was never filled. His mother, although present, struggled with her own emotional difficulties and couldn't provide the necessary support to her son. During his adolescence, Cullen displayed isolated and troubling behaviors. He often got involved in minor school incidents and had few friends. Teachers and classmates noticed something strange, but nothing serious enough to raise alarms. After finishing high school, he decided to pursue a career in healthcare. He enrolled in a nursing vocational program in New Jersey. No one imagined that this quiet, reserved young man was about to begin a dark journey. His first job was at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. There, he began to show technical skills above average. He knew how to handle complex medications and remained calm under pressure. But the first signs of something abnormal also began to surface. Staff members reported unusual situations. Stable patients suddenly worsened after being treated by Cullen. The deaths were recorded as natural or due to complications, but some colleagues suspected otherwise. Still, he kept getting promoted. He worked in several major hospitals, including University Hospital in Newark and St. Luke's Hospital in Allentown, places where mortality rates skyrocketed during his time there. Cullen maintained a calm, almost zen posture, even in the most tense moments. He was respected by superiors and reliable in critical situations. But behind this image hid someone deeply disturbed. He had already been hospitalized twice in psychiatric clinics before becoming a nurse. In one of them, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and severe depression. Despite this, he always returned to the workforce without further questions. At the time, the American healthcare system had huge flaws in verifying the employment history of healthcare professionals. Thus, despite previous dismissals under vague accusations, Cullen easily found new jobs. On several occasions, coworkers complained about his strange behavior, excessive overtime, refusal to leave the hospital after shifts ended, and a morbid interest in the progression of terminally ill patients. A doctor from St. Luke's Hospital stated years later that Cullen used to watch coma patients for long periods. It was as if he was waiting for something, she said in a recorded testimony for later documentaries. Medical records show he manipulated medications precisely and discreetly. He used lethal doses of insulin, digoxin, and other heart medications. Everything was done so technically that, initially, no one associated the sudden deaths with him. The big problem was that, for a long time, these deaths were seen as part of the hospital routine. Patients in ICUs carry high risks, and many are already in delicate condition. This facilitated Cullen's silent operation for years. But the gears of fate were already moving. In the next session, we will discover how a simple conversation between two nurses changed the course of everything, leading to the definitive investigation that would bring Cullen face to face with justice. It was the year 2002, and at St. Luke's Hospital in Allentown, Pennsylvania, two nurses exchanged information during a work break. Neither of them imagined that this conversation would change not only their lives but also the history of criminal justice in the United States. Amy Luffren was an experienced nurse, a single mother responsible for caring for the most critical patients in the intensive care unit. For weeks, she had noticed something strange in the medical charts of recent discharges, or rather, recent deaths. Her colleague, whose name remains confidential, had also observed the same patterns. Whenever Charles Cullen was on duty, stable patients experienced sudden cardiac failures. And worse, without an apparent cause. What seemed like a coincidence began taking darker shapes. Amy decided to do some discreet checks. She compared medical records from previous months and noticed a terrifying pattern. Deaths increased whenever Cullen was scheduled for the night shift. She knew she needed to share her findings with someone trustworthy. She decided to approach another senior nurse who had worked at the hospital for years. When she showed the data, the reaction was surprise and fear. "This can't be a coincidence," the colleague said. The two began investigating discreetly. They reviewed patient records, talked to other staff members, and compared medication administration times with the moments of unexpected cardiac arrests. The results were disturbing enough to ignore. Amy decided to go further. With access to the hospital's medical system, she cross-referenced drug usage data with death reports from the past 2 years. What she saw made her heart race. Cullen withdrew larger doses of cardiac medications than necessary, always right before an unexpected death. Even with all this evidence, they feared acting openly. One wrong step could put their careers at risk or worse, alert Cullen that he was being watched. They needed to find a safe way to expose what they suspected. That's when Amy made a crucial decision. Without telling anyone at the hospital, she contacted the local police department. She wanted to speak to someone who could analyze the facts impartially and start a discreet investigation. Detectives Timothy Braun and Stephen Carbo were assigned to the case. Both had experience in complex crimes and knew of similar cases in other hospitals. When they heard what Amy had to say, they understood they were facing something serious. Carbo and Braun arranged a secret meeting with Amy outside the hospital. There, she handed over copies of medical records, lists of medication schedules, and even personal notes she had taken over the past months. The official investigation had begun. The officers quickly realized they would need technical help. They contacted specialists in hospital and pharmaceutical analysis who would help identify which drugs were being tampered with and how they could cause so many deaths without immediate alarms. Meanwhile, Amy returned to the hospital with a dangerous mission: continue observing Cullen without raising suspicion. She knew that any change in her behavior could compromise everything. Cullen, in turn, maintained his normal routine: calm, efficient, and always willing to help. No one there imagined that behind that gentle smile hid a silent killer with hundreds of victims in his record. But now, for the first time, he was being watched. In the next session, we will follow how the detectives built a surveillance network around Cullen, collected concrete evidence, and began pressing him with increasingly difficult questions to answer. With the information provided by Amy Luffren, detectives Timothy Braun and Stephen Carbo understood they were facing something unusual. It wasn't just a vague suspicion, it was clear patterns, consistent data, and a history of suspicious deaths directly linked to Charles Cullen. But investigating a healthcare professional wasn't easy. Cullen had an impeccable reputation within the hospital. He was respected by colleagues, reliable during night shifts, and even praised for his technical skill. Any misstep could alert him and make him flee or erase traces. The detectives decided on a discreet approach. They requested access to internal medical records from St. Luke's Hospital, especially those related to manipulated medications and deaths that occurred in the past 2 years. At the same time, they contacted forensic toxicology experts to analyze autopsy reports of recently deceased patients. They wanted to know if there were indications of foreign substances in the victims' bodies. The first results surprised everyone. In at least 3 cases, abnormally high amounts of insulin and digoxin were found in the blood of the deceased, medications used to treat diabetes and heart problems, but lethal in high doses. Now the theory gained strength. Cullen wasn't just making medical errors. He was deliberately administering deadly high doses, leaving no obvious evidence. His technical training and knowledge of pharmacology made his actions almost invisible. To advance the investigation, the detectives needed more than documents. They decided to install hidden cameras in medication storage areas and intravenous solution preparation rooms, places where Cullen often spent a lot of time alone. They also began discreetly monitoring his movements inside the hospital. Entry and exit times, breaks, routes between departments, and conversations with other staff members were closely observed. Amy Luffren continued to be a key player in this process. Discreetly, she kept the detectives informed about changes in Cullen's behavior, possible reactions to unusual questions, and even details about his personal life. One of the most important discoveries came while reviewing Cullen's professional history. He had worked at several different hospitals, and in each one, similar reports surfaced. Inexplicable increases in deaths, abrupt dismissals under vague accusations, and mysterious transfers. This confirmed a pattern. Cullen wasn't acting on impulse. He planned. When the number of deaths rose too much in one place, he simply moved to another hospital, restarting the cycle with new victims and a new professional identity. The detectives also discovered that Cullen had been hospitalized twice in psychiatric clinics during his youth. An old medical record indicated a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, severe depression, and suicidal tendencies. And yet, he always managed to return to the workforce without further questioning. The system for verifying the professional history of nurses in the United States was extremely flawed at the time, and Cullen knew how to exploit this loophole. As the investigation progressed, the detectives began subtly pressuring Cullen with casual questions inside the hospital. They wanted to see his reaction, test his conscience, and try to catch inconsistencies in his speech. Cullen responded calmly, showing technical mastery and emotional control. But behind the mask of tranquility, something seemed different. He became quieter, more attentive, as if he knew for the first time that he was being watched closely. With the evidence beginning to accumulate, detectives Timothy Braun and Stephen Carbo decided to increase pressure on Charles Cullen. It was time to step out of the shadows and corner the suspect, without revealing all their cards yet. They scheduled an informal conversation with Cullen inside the hospital. Nothing official, just a casual chat seemingly about medical practices and safety in using controlled medications. but every word was carefully chosen. Cullen arrived calm, smiling slightly as always. He wore his spotless white uniform and maintained that almost zen posture that had fooled so many colleagues. But the detectives knew they were facing someone dangerous. The questions started lightly. They talked about medication routines, how he dealt with end-of-life patients, about his experiences in other hospitals. Cullen answered calmly, showing technical mastery and absolute control. Then Carbo changed the tone. He asked directly about certain unusual records from recent months, patients who died suddenly after receiving high doses of cardiac medications. Cullen's expression didn't change, but his eyes showed something: full attention. He replied coolly, "Patients in ICU have high risks. Sometimes nothing can be done." A generic, safe response. But the detectives noticed he was alert, trying to maintain control of the situation. Braun decided to press harder. He discreetly showed a copy of a medical report indicating abnormal levels of insulin in the blood of a patient who had died days earlier. He asked if Cullen had administered that dose. For a moment there was silence. Cullen took a deep breath, looked at the paper, and said, "I don't specifically recall that. I work with many patients, and sometimes the details get mixed up." It was a defensive response, but still calculated. He didn't deny, didn't confirm. He simply hid behind the intense routine of a healthcare professional. A smart move, but one that didn't fool the detectives. That same week, investigators gained access to a new set of data: internal records of the medication dispensing system. They discovered that Cullen withdrew larger than necessary quantities of potentially lethal substances. Additionally, recordings from hidden cameras in storage rooms began showing disturbing images. Cullen manipulating vials far longer than normal, cleaning containers before returning them, and adjusting intravenous solutions outside protocol. Amy Luffren, the nurse who initially raised the suspicions, was called again to help analyze these images. She recognized clear patterns in Cullen's behavior: precise, discreet, almost surgical movements. Meanwhile, Cullen started acting differently. He became more withdrawn, avoided long conversations with coworkers, and began refusing extra shifts, something unusual for him, as he was known for his excessive dedication. The detectives noticed these changes. Cullen was suspecting something. They knew that if they wanted to move forward, they needed concrete proof, something irrefutable linking him directly to the deaths. And that proof was about to emerge. In the next session, we will follow the exact moment when the detectives find a crucial clue: an altered medication sample that would lead to the most shocking confessions in history. It was early 2003, and detectives Timothy Braun and Stephen Carbo had already collected numerous indirect clues about Charles Cullen's actions. But they still lacked something concrete, a piece of evidence that could be used in court and prove beyond doubt that he was deliberately killing patients. That's when a new opportunity arose. A pharmacy technician at St. Luke's Hospital noticed something odd about an intravenous solution prepared by Cullen for a patient in the ICU. The coloration looked different, almost cloudy. The technician decided to keep that sample and discreetly alerted the medical supervisors. No one made a fuss, but the information reached the right ears and was immediately passed on to the detectives investigating the case. Braun and Carbo immediately requested the substance's analysis. It was sent to the county's forensic laboratory, where specialists began examining its chemical composition under microscopic detail. The results were shocking. Inside that solution were high quantities of digoxin, a medication used to treat heart conditions but extremely toxic in high doses. And there, in the vial, was well beyond the safe limit. More than that, the dosage was so high it could cause cardiac failure within minutes. It was exactly the kind of silent death that had been happening for months inside that hospital. Now, for the first time, they had physical evidence. With this evidence in hand, the detectives scheduled a new conversation with Cullen. This time, it wouldn't be casual or discreet. It would be a direct confrontation under surveillance and with questions that would be hard to answer. Cullen arrived at the meeting as always, calm, wearing his spotless white uniform, with that neutral gaze that had fooled so many of his colleagues. He sat down at the table and smiled slightly, as if he knew something was changing. Carbo placed the lab report in front of him and asked directly, Can you explain why this solution contains lethal levels of digoxin? Cullen's smile vanished. He looked at the paper, took a deep breath, and fell silent. Several endless seconds passed. The detectives kept their eyes fixed on him, waiting for any reaction. Anger, defense, denial. But what came was unexpected. A deep sigh, followed by a cold, controlled response. I need to talk to someone before answering. It was the first time Cullen asked for legal help. Until then, he had never shown fear or real concern. That change in posture indicated he knew he was being surrounded by solid evidence. Even so, the detectives kept pressing. They showed other medical records, lists of patients who died after receiving medications manipulated by him, and even footage from hidden cameras showing his movements at night. Cullen watched everything impassively. He didn't deny, didn't confirm, but his body spoke for him. His hands trembled slightly, he avoided eye contact, and he answered each question with long pauses, as if building a mental strategy. At the end of the conversation, he asked to leave. He said he needed to think. The detectives agreed. They knew the net was closing. They had the physical evidence they needed. Now, it was only a matter of time until Cullen broke completely. In the days following the direct confrontation with detectives Timothy Braun and Stephen Carbo, Charles Cullen began acting differently inside the hospital. He was quieter, more observant. He avoided eye contact, refused extra shifts, and seemed to constantly be analyzing exits, as if preparing to run at any moment. Amy Luffren, the nurse who initially raised the suspicions, noticed this change. She reported to detectives Timothy Braun and Stephen Carbo that Cullen had started cleaning his desk, organizing his personal documents, and even discreetly asking about possible transfers to other hospitals. It was obvious. He knew he was being surrounded, and for the first time he showed signs of real nervousness. The mask of calmness was starting to crack. It was only a matter of time before he collapsed completely. The detectives decided to increase the pressure. They scheduled a new conversation with Cullen, but this time it wouldn't be inside the hospital. It would take place in an official interrogation room, under full surveillance and with audio and video recording. Cullen agreed to attend. He wore his white uniform again, as if trying to maintain the image of a respectable professional. But now, everyone in the room knew the truth. He was a dangerous criminal responsible for hundreds of deaths. In the interrogation room, the detectives laid out all the evidence collected up to that point. Medical reports, footage from hidden cameras, laboratory analyses, and even copies of previous dismissal records from other hospitals. For a few minutes, Cullen stared silently at everything. Then he took a deep breath and said something unexpected. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." It was the first time he admitted doing anything wrong, even if vaguely. Braun decided to explore this opening moment. He asked directly, "How many patients did you kill?" Silence reigned in the room once again. Cullen lowered his eyes, slightly shook his head, and replied, "More than I can count." It was shocking. Until then, the detectives had indications that he might be responsible for dozens of deaths. But hearing that sentence confirmed the worst-case scenario. Cullen had committed hundreds of murders throughout his career. Carbo pressed further. "Did you choose the patients? Did you have any criteria?" Cullen hesitated, took a deep breath and said, "Some were already very ill. I just accelerated the process." A cold response, almost philosophical, as if trying to justify his actions with a distorted view of mercy. But the detectives wouldn't let it slide. They showed photos of victims who still had chances of recovery, showed reports from families who suffered premature grief. They wanted him to understand the real impact of his actions. Surprisingly, Cullen didn't deny anything. On the contrary, he cried, not out of remorse but relief, as if, after years of hiding the truth, he finally had someone to share the weight of his choices with. He described technical details about how he manipulated medications, how he chose ideal times to avoid suspicion, how he remained calm even in the most tense moments. It was as if he were giving a lecture on how to commit murder without leaving a trace. This partial confession was recorded and became one of the most impactful pieces of the case. The audio recordings obtained during this interrogation would later be used in documentaries, books, and even criminalistics classes, serving as an example of the psychological profile of a serial killer within a medical environment. After days of intense interrogations and direct confrontations with detectives Timothy Braun and Stephen Carbo, Charles Cullen realized he had no way out. The evidence was stacked against him: medical records, lab analyses, hidden camera footage. Everything pointed to his criminal actions. But even in the face of undeniable proof, Cullen still tried to maintain some control over his narrative. He knew he would be convicted. What he wanted was to avoid a life sentence without parole. And for that, he decided to negotiate. His lawyers contacted the public prosecutor handling the case. The offer was clear. Cullen would confess to all his crimes, including deaths in other hospitals, in exchange for a lighter sentence. Instead of life imprisonment, he requested consecutive sentences with the possibility of parole after decades behind bars. The proposal caused a major impact within the judicial system. For the victims' families, it was unacceptable that a man responsible for hundreds of deaths could bargain for a lesser punishment. But for investigators, this confession could reveal truths that had remained hidden until then. Detectives Braun and Carbo were divided. On one hand, they wanted full justice. On the other, they knew that if Cullen went to trial, he might remain silent and take the knowledge of hundreds of undiscovered murders with him. After weeks of negotiations, an agreement was reached. Cullen signed a detailed confession, describing every hospital where he worked, which patients had been affected, and exactly how he manipulated medications. In return, he received 11 homicide convictions and a prison sentence of 30 years with the possibility of parole after that period. It was a controversial decision. Many considered it too lenient for someone who had taken so many lives. Victims' families expressed outrage, saying the American penal system was being too soft on a serial killer. Still, the deal was accepted by the court. Cullen spent hours recording detailed testimonies, explaining how he selected his victims, how he manipulated medical records, and how he managed to escape suspicion for so long. He also revealed names of patients who died under his supervision but whose deaths had never officially been linked to him. These confessions helped close open cases from years ago, bringing at least some answers to families who had suffered without understanding what truly happened. At times, Cullen seemed almost proud of himself. He described complex techniques of dosage manipulation, spoke with technical expertise about pharmacology, and even laughed slightly when recalling situations where he had fooled colleagues and superiors. There was no real remorse, no sincere apology, just a desire to tell his story, not as an act of redemption, but as a way to make it clear how intelligent he believed he had been to deceive an entire system for so long. The recordings of these testimonies were later used in documentaries and investigative reports. They showed a cold, calculating, and deeply disturbed man, yet one who maintained a certain fascination with his own story. Amy Luffren, the nurse who first raised suspicions, had access to these recordings. In later interviews, she said hearing Cullen confess like that was a mix of relief and horror. On one hand, I got answers. On the other, I was shocked by how easily he talked about killing. With the deal finalized, the legal process moved quickly. Cullen was not brought to a public trial. He pleaded guilty in a formal hearing and received his sentence: 11 counts of murder, with combined prison terms totaling 30 years. But many people asked themselves, was this really the appropriate punishment? When news of the deal with Charles Cullen spread, a wave of outrage swept across American society. Newspapers, TV channels, and social media began discussing intensely. How could a man responsible for hundreds of deaths receive only 30 years in prison? Family members of the victims were the most affected. Many felt justice had not been served. To them, the deal seemed like a way to close the case without proportional punishment for the crime committed. A mother whose son died under Cullen's care stated in an interview, "He took my son from me, and now he'll spend less time in prison than I lived with him." Her words echoed in thousands of hearts carrying pain and frustration. Despite the controversy, the case also served as a turning point for the U.S. medical system. The flaws that allowed Cullen to operate for so long were put under scrutiny and demanded urgent changes. One of the main issues identified was the hiring system for nurses. At the time, it was possible for a professional fired from one hospital to get a job at another without their history being thoroughly investigated. This allowed Cullen to continue his criminal path for decades. In response, several U.S. states began creating shared databases between hospitals, where serious mistakes, dismissals for misconduct, or suspicious accusations against healthcare professionals could be recorded and accessed before new hires. Additionally, monitoring of controlled medication use within hospitals increased. Digital systems for tracking drug dispensation were implemented, making it harder for employees to discreetly manipulate doses. Security cameras were also installed in medication storage rooms and intravenous solution preparation areas. The goal was to ensure total transparency and prevent errors or crimes from going unnoticed. The Cullen case also led to changes in the training of healthcare professionals. Universities and nursing schools started including courses on medical ethics, behavioral surveillance, and identifying potential psychological deviations among colleagues. Many experts argued that the biggest mistake wasn't Cullen committing the crimes, but rather the system failing to detect him for so long. This reflection led to a cultural reform within hospital environments. In the legal world, the case sparked debates about minimum sentences for complex crimes. Jurists and human rights advocates discussed whether plea bargains should allow criminals to trade confessions for lighter sentences, especially when multiple deaths were involved. Charles Cullen, even behind bars, became a case study in criminal psychology programs. His psychological profile, distorted motivations, and ability to fool even experienced colleagues were analyzed for years. Documentaries, books, and even cinematic productions were created based on the case. One of the most well-known is The Good Nurse, adapted from the real investigative book of the same name, released on Netflix in 2022. Amy Luffren herself, the nurse who first raised suspicions, participated in several interviews and documentaries, sharing her experience and warning other healthcare professionals about the importance of staying vigilant in the face of unusual patterns. But above all, the case left a clear legacy: the need for transparency, ethics, and constant oversight in the medical environment. In 2004, Charles Cullen was officially sentenced to 30 years in prison for 11 premeditated murders. He entered the New Jersey prison system under maximum security measures, as his presence among other inmates represented real risks. Cullen serves his sentence in solitary confinement and is kept mostly isolated from other prisoners. Because he was a former healthcare professional, there are ongoing concerns that he might try to manipulate or harm other inmates or even medical staff inside the prison. Contrary to what many imagined, Cullen did not become an easy target inside the prison. His calm and discreet personality helped him keep conflicts at bay. But he is also avoided by other inmates who know who he is and what he did. In recent years, Cullen has led an extremely private life. He does not participate in group activities, has few visits, and rarely gives interviews. When questioned about his crimes, he usually responds vaguely, showing no real regret. He was eligible to request parole after serving 15 years of his sentence, meaning since 2019. However, all his requests have been denied. Authorities consider him still a danger to society. In recent hearings, the parole board stated that Cullen has never shown true remorse or behavioral change. Additionally, they noted that he maintains a controlling and cold demeanor, traits that defined him during his criminal career. Even though locked away, Cullen's name still haunts American hospitals. Many healthcare professionals report fearing unusual patterns during night shifts or certain combinations of medications that resemble the methods he used. His case permanently changed how hospitals monitor medication use. Today, digital systems track every withdrawal of controlled substances. Any deviation from the norm immediately alerts supervisors and even regulatory agencies. Furthermore, internal protocols now strongly encourage communication between nurses and doctors regarding suspicions of misconduct. The phrase, "when something seems wrong, say something," became a motto in many medical institutions. The case also inspired legal movements in the United States, such as the proposed law known as the Nurse Accountability and Patient Safety Act, which requires all hospitals to verify the complete professional history of new employees before hiring. Charles Cullen never publicly apologized. In private conversations with investigators, he once said he believed he was doing the right thing by accelerating the deaths of severely ill patients. A twisted justification that shocked even the most experienced professionals in the field. Nevertheless, he became a case study for forensic psychiatrists. His medical file shows old diagnoses of bipolar disorder, severe depression, and psychopathic tendencies. But experts agree that none of this justifies his actions. For the families of the victims, the grieving process never ended. Many formed mutual support groups, seeking emotional healing through shared stories and experiences. Some also engaged in campaigns for healthcare system reforms. Amy Luffren, the nurse who started it all, now lives a quiet life away from the spotlight. She continues working in healthcare, but prefers not to return to hospital settings. In testimonies, she says the case forever changed her view on trust and vigilance in medical work. Charles Cullen is today a forgotten man on the streets, but remembered in classrooms, documentaries, and hospital corridors. A reminder that evil doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes, it wears a white coat, a gentle smile, and holds a syringe in its hands.